Welcome to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. Our podcast is dedicated to helping Christians target the right priorities in their apostolic and interior lives.
Well, hello once again, and welcome to On the Mark. I'm Peter Buckley, your host, and I'm bringing in now Mark O'Donnell, our guest, and the guy who's going to provide us with his wisdom and insight. Mark, welcome and take it away.
Great to be here, Peter. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to speaking about St. Paul since his feast day is coming up on June 29th.
Yeah, it's very appropriate. I mean, we're kind of chronologically moving through the Acts of the Apostles, and we are on this 9th chapter, which is, I don't know, for people who don't know a lot about the Bible, they seem to know something about Paul's conversion, and it's covered here in this 9th chapter. So, that you make a point, this feast day is coming up, and I guess we like to assign these superlatives to people, and, whether it be in the literary world or athletics or whatever, but I mean, he may be the greatest evangelizer of all time. And so we can probably learn a lot from him about, our little theme here is kind of workplace evangelization. But maybe just let's start talking about that. I mean, so not just restricted to the 9th chapter of Acts, but just in terms of his conversion overall, and then throughout Acts, more fully than just in the 9th chapter.
Sure. Well, thanks, Peter. I mean, St. Paul is one of my heroes, no question about it. I mean, for a whole host of reasons, which we can't all explore in this episode. But we can start with his conversion. God sees him persecuting the early Christians and literally stops him dead in his tracks. Paul had overseen the martyrdom of St. Stephen and the killing of other Christians as well. He tells us in Acts 26 later on. Sometimes the only way to stop an evil is to confront it, and God steps in and does the confronting. He does not just stop Paul, he converts him, so much so that when Paul is convinced Jesus is the Christ, he begins preaching it, and then he faces immediate death threats there in Damascus and Jerusalem. But, he's not a shrinking violet, and the first lesson we can learn from him is that we should not be afraid to speak when we're called upon to do so. And we are often called upon to do so if we're willing to engage.
And we see him, he's preaching, yes, but he's also preaching early on in a synagogue. And he was preacher, of course, before his great conversion. He has letters from the chief priest to stop the spread of Christianity in Damascus, and which is good, but we're not the recipients of such letters, and nor are we called to round up the heretics. I mean, so how do we, as professionals in the workplace, how do we carry out this call to evangelize in our professional environments?
True. We're not being sent to round up the heretics by our local bishop, but we are called to announce the good news of the gospel to our colleagues. And this we need to do in the most appropriate ways that we can discern. St. Paul was not only an emissary of the chief priest before his conversion, we learn in Acts, but also he's a tent maker. He had a job, he worked, he supported himself with his own hands. He did not live off the largesse of others. In fact, he states that rather clearly. And two of the people he evangelizes, he meets through his work, Aquila and Priscilla, who are also tent makers. He thereby gives us a great example of evangelization in the workplace. And also at the end of Romans, Paul sends greetings to over 30 people by name. Some he calls fellow laborers. So I'm sure he met some of them while he was working as a tent maker.
Interesting point. So, I mean, we see Paul, he didn't always have this captive audience in a synagogue that were obligated to listen to him. And so, yeah, I mean, he's evangelizing his peers as well. Later on, he says he's learned to live in all sets of circumstances with all kinds of people, the rich, the poor, the kings and slaves, etc. And so how can we take something from that? I mean, how can we learn to do the same thing in our circumstances, in our environments, they're going to vary over time?
Certainly. Pursue the truth. When Paul was persecuting the Christians, he did what he thought was the right thing to do. According to St. John Henry Newman, his sin was not so much the persecution of the Christians as it was his failure to study Scripture closely enough to be able to identify that Jesus was the Christ. So we need to avoid making that mistake, and we avoid that mistake by reading and meditating on Scripture. Evaluate how it plays out in your own life. You may see the difficulties you're struggling with differently if you do this. For example, Jesus tells us that we will be persecuted if we stand up for him and try to tell others about him. When this actually happens, do we act with indignation and demand that our rights are somehow being violated? Or do we accept the persecution as something allowed by God for our benefit? If we desire to be saints, we need to accept it. And this is precisely what happened to the early Christians, and those are the people we want to imitate, or we say we want to imitate. The short of it is that in order to become holy, we must be changed, and change entails a certain amount of pain and suffering. Let's accept that pain and suffering in pursuit of the truth. That way, it will help us on our way to becoming saints. Complaining is almost always a sign that we have misunderstood this basic gospel precept.
Well, he certainly does suffer. I mean, he was persecuted, he was stoned, he's flogged, shipwrecked. And so, I mean, certainly he had his share of crosses. And what I think I'm hearing you say is it's an example for us. We should try to somehow connect our suffering that we have to endure to the pursuit of truth. And that's right. I mean, that makes it more bearable and beneficial for us. It seems as though will have an impact on our interior lives for sure. But how do we then say this is a form of evangelization, having to endure all this suffering?
Well, when our work colleagues see how we handle hardship and disappointment, they see that we're drawing on strength outside of ourselves. Otherwise, we would not be able to do it. I remember one time I was being laid off from a job or fired, and it was a stressful situation. My boss read me the riot act and gave me walking papers, and the lawyer sat in and wrote up the conversation. And later on, I saw the lawyer at the gym. He came up to me from behind, slapped me on my shoulder, and said, "Well, you handled that pretty well today." He was impressed that I did not have a breakdown or fly into a rage, while being let go. And I realized then that God had given me the strength to endure that hardship. And the lawyer witnessed and was edified by my behavior. So that is a form of evangelization. Uh, Not every hardship has to be as rough as being laid off. It could be as simple as not finding a parking space when you need one. But the asceticism is the same. Following Christ closely, like Paul did, makes us resilient and able to endure attacks, setbacks, hardships better than those who refuse to follow Christ, who refuse the cross. And this is in part because we do not refuse the crosses God sends our way. There's much to be learned from this simple truth. The crosses are needed elements for us to enter and enjoy heaven at the highest level possible.
I've heard from some people that have been listening to some of the previous episodes saying, this is sounds very good at some level inspiring, but they're wondering how do they start this whole process of evangelizing in the workplace. And so, as you mentioned, Paul's a tent maker. He makes a couple of buddies with other tent makers, but we're in different environments, and some perhaps in a more professional kind of environment. But I think this is a challenge for a lot of good people and well-intended people that this how to actually evangelize with their colleagues in the workplace. And so sadly, what happens is it paralyzes them, and so they don't. There's no real effort to evangelizing, and at best, what you see happen is they may invite somebody to a Bible study or perhaps some church event that they'll be attending. And most company these days would not like that. I mean, they would kind of perceive this as a proselytizing kind of activity. So how do we manage that? How do we circumvent or uh, get around those kind of potential obstacles?
Don't evangelize that way. I mean, that's the lazy approach. The one size fits all doesn't work. Imagine everybody wearing size 8 or size 12 shoes. you know, half the people will be tripping or not able to walk. I mean, don't look to simply build up the number of attendees to an activity, whatever it might be. It neglects the needs of the individual person. And how do we know those needs? Well, we don't unless they tell us. So we have to start with prayer. It sounds simple. We've said it before, but every day we have to pray for our colleagues by name, and we have to pray for them at Mass. We have to be consistent in doing this, and this is how it all begins. You know, the Holy Spirit wants our colleagues to change to be good much more than we do. He'll prompt them to change using our example and words when needed, but he cannot do that if we're not there. So be sure to get out of the house and work at something. Even regular volunteering is a form of work. Then pray for your colleagues, no matter what spiritual condition they may be in. Align your work with the truth. Don't cut corners. Don't lie or cheat to get ahead. Don't over promote yourself. Involve others in projects you work on by giving them substantive things to do. Don't use people for your own advantage. You know, these are all forms of authentic witness. And then look for informal conversational opportunities. I mean, they're there. We need to pick up on them. For example, we can ask our colleagues, you know, what's up for the weekend? What are you doing over Thanksgiving? Do you have any plans for vacation this summer? By showing an interest in them, they will begin to show an interest in us. And when they do, simply answer the questions they put to you without a lot of brouhaha, you know. And if we continue praying for them every day as we're working with them, this process will unfold naturally.
Yeah, so this requires uh, us to be really attentive, or at least aware, or the sense of having our antenna up to pay attention to what our colleagues might be telling us and saying to us. And that's not easy to do, right? I mean, this because there's competition, trying to have our antenna up when we're being bombarded with a lot of, you know, distractions, emails, text messages, ads, just the basic noise that's going on all around us. And so, how do we do that? How do we remain or have this position of attentiveness when we do have a lot of distractions competing for our time and our our awareness?
Well, I think, you know, in essence, we have to become contemplative. And okay, well, what is that? Well, let me tell you the story that the founder of Opus Dei, Jose Maria Escriva, told us in a film one time. And his feast day is this Friday, so a big shout out to Saint Jose Maria. But he told the story of a truck driver in Spain who was traveling along the road, and the guy was hitchhiking, and he stopped to pick him up, and the hitchhiker said, "Are you alone?" And the driver said, "Yes, get in." So he gets in, and they start driving. As they're driving, the hitchhiker turns to the driver and says, "Why did you hesitate when I asked you if you were alone?" And the driver said, "Well, I don't know if you can understand this, but I'm never alone because God is always in my soul and grace, and I can always speak with him." And then the hitchhiker yells out, "Stop, stop, stop." And the driver stops the car and he says, "I'm the parish priest. I was running away."
Mm,
And it's a great story, you know, because that's what we have to be. We have to be contemplatives, and we have to be in conversation with God as we go about our daily activities the best we can. And then opportunities will happen, just like the hitchhiker was there. And he didn't know the guy was the parish priest.
mhm,
You know,
mhm.
we don't know what condition people are in. But if we're praying for them and if we're trying to be in communion with God during the downtime of our day, when we're not on the phone or on email, we can develop this contemplative spirit. And that's what we need to have. Yeah. And then we'll be able to help others. But also it's a great way to live because it gives meaning to our day-to-day humdrum lives. They stop becoming humdrum, you know, when we bring God into them. And so here's a guy who I don't know his name. I don't know the driver's name. I don't know where he lived. I don't know if he was married or single, had kids, anything. He's anonymous, but in a way, he's famous. And if you're willing to accept that form of fame, you can live a great life and you can help hundreds of people. And it takes humility to do that, but it's a great way to live.
Yeah, it's a really good story. I've heard that, but that's a great reminder. Well, we're coming up to the time where we're going to conclude things here. We'll continue with Acts maybe just for another session or two. But this is really great, Mark. I appreciate this. And the hope here is that we can look to St. Paul and ask for his intercession for us in these efforts of ours to evangelize in the workplace. You reminded us this is a very fruitful time of year in the church for a lot of recognizing some great saints. Yesterday, at the time we're recording this, on the 22nd of June, feast day of two great men, St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. We have St. Josemaria coming up on the 26th, and then St. Paul, of course, on the 29th. So this is ample opportunities for us to go to these great saints and ask for their help and guidance as we try to tackle a very important mission of ours, which is to be apostolic and evangelize in the workplace. So thank you once again, Mark, and thank you all for tuning in and joining us for this episode of On the Mark.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening to On the Mark with Peter Buckley and Mark O'Donnell. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to be notified every time Peter and Mark release a new episode. And visit us on the web at onthemark.show.